Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our first look at the Crisis 24 Global Risk Forecast of 2025. I'm joined here today by our Senior Vice President of Global Operations and Intelligence, Mick Sharp, and our Directors of Intelligence, Jonathan Keemer and Sumedha Senanayake. Between them, they have decades of experience in global risk and deep subject matter expertise. Welcome, gentlemen, to our discussion today. The Crisis 24 Global Risk Forecast, now in its 15th year, is an in-depth intelligence analysis of key trends and events most likely to impact business operations within the next 6 to 12 months. We'll be hosting a series of webinars to expand on these trends and events, and today we will be previewing some highlights of what to expect as we move into 2025. So, speaking of those key trends and events happening in 2025, Jonathan, if you had to identify the biggest theme facing global security in 2025, what would that be?
Well, the standout thread that runs through the 2025 Global Risk Forecast is the global impacts of the conflicts that are ongoing in Ukraine and the Middle East. Now, in 2022-2023, it was all about Ukraine and the global ramifications of that conflict, but that has increasingly been joined by destabilization arising from the Middle East conflict as well. And in some areas, this conflict we're starting to see signs of overlap between those two conflicts as well.
You know, Jonathan, in 2025, it's becoming more apparent that the conflict in the Middle East and the ongoing war in Ukraine are symptomatic of new geopolitical fault lines or fissures with Russia, Iran, and North Korea on one side, and the US and its allies on the other.
Yeah, we should say that this state-level polarization is also increasingly intersecting at grassroots level as the state-level actors involved in the global face-off are actually exploiting societal divisions within their adversaries through the means of hostile cyber activity, misinformation, disinformation campaigns, and the use of proxies, whether that be the use of proxy protest groups, or even in some locations, the use of proxy militant terrorist groups.
You know, in the 2024 version of the Global Risk Forecast, the conflict in the Middle East was largely limited to Hamas and Israel. But we did stress that the conflict would likely widen and expand further, both regionally and its impacts would be felt globally. And now what we see is the involvement of Lebanese Hezbollah, the Al-Houthis in Yemen, Iranian proxies in Iraq, and on at least two occasions, a direct military engagement between Israel and Iran. How this conflict will either escalate, de-escalate, or remain the status quo will depend on what moves and counter-moves Israel and Iran take. I think one of the biggest issues in 2025 will be what policies the incoming US administration will take, both domestically and internationally.
That is a fantastic point, Sumedha. So how do you see this situation developing in the coming year?
President-elect Donald Trump's administration will be faced with numerous challenges and issues on the domestic and international front. Internationally, with the conflict in the Middle East, what steps will the administration take to foster a concerted dialogue with the belligerents to arrive at a durable peace? As I said earlier, since the conflict began in October 2023, it's widened further and escalated with the involvement of Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. What will the administration do to prevent this conflict from expanding further? And with Ukraine, Trump said on the campaign trail that he could end the war in 24 hours, but he did not offer any specific details on how he would do that. Senior officials in his incoming administration have said they do not want to provide open-ended military aid to Ukraine. So will this open direct negotiations with Moscow? And with China, how will the administration contend with increasing economic competition with China? And on the domestic front, even though Trump won the popular vote, political polarization is still a significant issue in the US. Misinformation, disinformation are widespread, especially now with advancements in artificial intelligence technologies. Now, this political polarization and the spread of misinformation and disinformation, coupled with what many consider rising economic inequality may lead to increased instances of unrest in the coming year. And with that, I want to take a moment to stress that the Americas team will be providing a standalone webinar on the aftermath of the US elections in mid-January. And the Europe team will be providing a webinar on the current status of the Ukraine war in early 2025.
Absolutely. That's a great call out. Thank you, Samitha. So, Jonathan, I want to get back to you. You mentioned an overlap between what is happening around Israel and the Ukraine conflicts. Can you expand a little bit on that for me?
Yeah, we're increasingly picking up signs of the intersection between these two conflicts. So I'll give you two examples. So first of all, we would have all seen recent announcements that the US is now willing to allow Ukraine to use its long-range missile systems in Russia proper. Now, Russia has made no secret of the fact that if the US were to allow, and other Western countries were to allow the use of their weapon systems in Russia proper, that Moscow would regard this as a significant escalation. And what Russia has been doing to deter this permission has been to dangle the threat that it might supply Houthi rebels in Yemen with longer range, more effective anti-ship missiles. Now, the Houthis, as you know, have been targeting shipping in the Red Sea for some months now. So what we're actually seeing is a possible retaliation by the Russians in the Middle East for an action that is actually happening in Ukraine. And the second example is if we saw recently in October, we saw the Israeli strikes against Iran. Now, these were reportedly striking missile and drone production facilities in Iran. Now, ostensibly to limit the ability of Tehran to supply these systems to its proxies in the region. But of course, Iran is also a major supplier of drone systems such as the Shahed 136 to Russia, which Russia is using in Ukraine. So if you think about it this way, the Israeli strikes against Iran could have a detrimental effect on Russia's ability to carry out its strategic bombing campaign against Ukraine. So they're beginning to increasingly intersect.
Yeah, you bring up some fantastic points there. So do you think it would be fair to say that the Middle East and Ukraine will dominate the security space through 2025?
I do think so, but I think we also need to remember that there are other issues worth mentioning. For example, in Africa, government instability and rising militancy in the Sahel region will almost certainly create a worsening security conditions in the region. And this despite the creation of the Alliance of Sahel States. Protests, specifically youth protests, may expand across the continent as Africa's digitally connected youth share grievances and mobilization strategies. And with regards to the environment, extreme weather is now what we call the new normal due to climate change. Higher temperatures, more severe storms that are happening more frequently will prompt countries, societies, and organizations to adapt and take contingency plans. And with regards to other issues in the health sector, global conflict will increasingly hinder public global health efforts as healthcare infrastructure collapses, vaccination programs grind to a halt, and infectious diseases surge in affected regions. Health crises in conflict zones will have the potential to have global effects through displaced populations, which may adversely affect regional and international public health systems.
Absolutely. So we've referenced this emerging fault line in a few different ways. So I think to conclude and to bring us home, what do you see as the most likely global impacts of this emerging fault line? Jonathan, what do you think?
There are two areas that will be disrupted. First of all, we've got the disruptive effects on business operations, and that might be through the use of hostile cyber activity disrupting or causing sporadic disruptions to critical national infrastructure. We have the disruptions to aviation. Mm-hmm. So with conflicts going on, we have restrictions to, over those conflicts, we have restrictions to air travel. Airlines are having to make sort of big detours to avoid these areas. They add to the flight times, they add to the costs. We might see things like some airlines limiting their services entirely, cutting the ability of somebody to travel from A to B because the airline no longer wants to go all the way around the threatened location. And we might see the increased costs and the sacrifices that airlines have to do to keep their businesses safe. We might see some airlines beginning to go out of business, which again will detrimentally affect the air travel industry. On the maritime front, we have the effects of the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea. This is causing huge disruption to maritime supply chains, as ships are going to have to go the long way around the Cape rather than use the Suez Canal. This adds, could add over a week to supply times. We're also seeing other effects of this sort of the fact that these ships are having to stay at sea longer with their cargoes. We're seeing overcrowding of stock in, say, Chinese ports. We're seeing supply chains stretched in Europe as they're having to wait for sort of longer time for things traveling from the Far East to Europe, for example. So those are effects on the business operations. We also have the more traditional security threats as well. So we mentioned the exploitation of these divisions by hostile actors. Now this is leading to adversarial protests. That's also exacerbated by the persistence of the conflict in the Middle East particularly. I mean, Palestine, Israel, that's a very, very divisive issue in just about every location of the world. So we're seeing disruptive and sometimes violent protests in North America, in Europe and elsewhere. Also, there is, of course, the traditional threat of, and we've seen it before, the longer the conflict in the Middle East continues, the more likely that we're going to see radicalization within globally that could lead to an uptick in extremism. And in Western Europe, for example, we could see actually an increase in the terrorist threat as well.
Well, we've covered a lot of points today. Mick, I would like to turn it over to you. What do you see as being top of mind as we move into 2025?
Certainly the persistence of major conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East, the impact as well on the more pronounced fault line on local conflicts and areas of instability, an increased likelihood of asymmetric attacks, including cyber attacks on critical infrastructure and global systems. And overall, businesses are most likely to be impacted in the area of business continuity, business travel, and supply chain.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mick, for sharing those insights. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you all for joining our discussion today. The insights shared here are very impactful as we start looking forward to planning in 2025, and this was a great introduction to the topics that we will be expanding upon in our Crisis 24 Global Risk Forecast. If you enjoyed today's session and you're excited to learn more, there are a couple of things that I encourage you to do. First, I'll ask you to look in your console on the bottom left-hand side of the screen to sign up for early access to our report when it releases next month. Secondly, I encourage you to be on the lookout for an invitation to our upcoming webinar series where we'll interview more of our subject matter experts on the key trends in the coming year. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to our intelligence experts, and everyone have a fantastic rest of your day.